So today's lesson's on watercolor and basically basic watercolor techniques. Now my basic setup here is that I've got my watercolors on my non-dominant side. I've got my water near it, and of course I've got a little small paper towel just to kind of catch my colors. Now the reason I have 2 cups of water is so I can clean my brush out in one, then do a second dip in the other. This causes your water to have a cleaner, well, this causes what happens is, you know, I explained this all earlier, but I can't seem to figure it out how the words come out now. But the reason I have 2 cups of water is because basically out of laziness. I don't have to change my water as often if I have 2 cups of water, because I'll get most of the particulate out in here, and then a final rinse in here will make it sure my brush is good and clean. Also, I can get clean water out of this one instead of having to reach into my dirty water. So, first thing we're going to do is we're going to do a solid wash. Now, you can pick any color that you would like. You have to wet the watercolor, wet your brush, wet the watercolor a little bit, doesn't take a lot, and you just kind of fill in the spots. Now a solid wash means that it is just one solid color all the way around. If you need to pick up more water, you just go back and forth. You can also go side to side to help drag it out that way until you get it nice and even. That's the main goal, is just to kind of get it nice and even. I'm going to rinse my brush. Had a lot of color in this. Dab excess water off. Okay. Our next technique we're going to do is something called a gradient wash. Now, the best way to go about that is to paint the area with just a color of water, just a little coat of water, just so it's wet. Then take your color, start at the top, and back and forth, only dipping once. Now, when it comes to a gradient wash, you're not going to go side to side like this. You're just going to keep going back and forth. And it should be like slightly darker at the top than it is at the bottom. It should just kind of meld on. That one's not the most graceful of gradients. Take some water out of my brush. Let me see if I can pick some up. Now let's go back down. It's looking more like a solid wash. Let me get a little bit more at the top just to darken it up. There we go. It's starting to gradient out. Now, I'm not going by a lot here. You don't really need a whole lot with watercolor. If you need a lot, I will tell you need a lot. But most of the time, you only need just a little bit to get you going where you need to go. Okay. Our next technique is called wet on wet. This is one of the more popular ones because y'all really like tie-dye for some reason and y'all like the effect. So if I take my water, I'm going to lay down a small little area of water, just water, not a whole lot. I'm going to take my color, I'm going to drop it in. And you see how it spreads out? That's because of the water. You can add more water to it too to make it more flowy. At this stage, you can also clean your brush, get another color, drop it in as well. When it comes to wet on wet, you do want to make sure that your paper doesn't dry too quickly. So it doesn't mean like lay down like a crud ton of water. It just means don't, go take a break right after you lay down one layer for wet on wet and then expect it to be dry when you come back. So it only takes like a minute or two for it to completely dry if you lay down the right amount of color. You can also start dabbing it in like this and mixing colors. So I can go in here and mix them too. Just make sure you get your timing down. Now for wet over dry, we are just going to paint in an area. And I'm going to do some lines here. And we are going to let it dry. We can't do wet over dry if we don't have any dry, so we have to let some of the paint dry. You need to change my water soon, I didn't grab enough. Okay, masking. What I have right here, these dots are masking fluid. And those, basically, I'll be able to peel off later. Masking fluid is expensive, it works well, but it smells really bad. And the one upside to it other than its use is if you've ever watched satisfying videos and you see like face peels where they peel like the face mask off in like one big sheet, it acts like that sometimes. So you could also use for masking out using a piece of painter's tape or masking tape. Something like that will also do it. So just understand that if you don't have masking fluid like I have right here, painter's tape or masking tape will work just fine. Don't use duct tape. You want something that will release cleanly. Like I said, masking tape, paper tape, anything like that. You don't want something that's meant to hold it together. Also, I've had students in the past where they use masking tape and it tears their paper. When they go to peel it off. The best thing to do when it comes to that is to apply a little bit of heat to it. And what I mean by that is you can take a hair dryer, put it on like a warmer setting. Once all your stuff is dry, you can put it on a warmer setting, blow a little bit of the hot air onto the tape, and it'll peel up easier. It makes the glue loosen. So that's just a little bit of a small pro tip for you there. So right now I'm going to paint over my masked out areas, and you can see them resisting the paint. When it comes to the tape, you never want to push into the tape. You want to always start on the tape and come off of it. It kind of helps with the bleeding, because sometimes paint will bleed under the edges of this. So this helps kind of minimize that a little bit. So you want to just paint around, you want to start on the tape and paint off the edge. You don't want to start off of it and go into it. You just really, I did the opposite. It just really hurts you in the long run there. Okay, wax resist. Now I took a crayon and I made lines throughout here. Now the thing is, you don't have to use just a crayon. You can use, I've used a crayon, I've used a colored pencil, and I used an oil pastel. All three should be able to provide the same result, but a similar result, but in different kind of ways, just depending. When you use a crayon, all you got to do is just draw on it really hard and then paint over it, and it will resist the watercolor. If you do not have oil pastel or a white color pencil at home, don't worry about that. Just a plain old regular crayon, if you've got one of those, to do this right here. If you've got the other two, don't worry, go ahead. It's the same technique, basically. So if I go right in here and go in with a little bit of color, you don't want the color to be too strong. You kind of want it to be more liquidy than just pure paint. And you can see when I paint over it, you can start to see, instead of doing that, it just kind of falls off of it. And what'll happen, and it really did it well with the crayon right here. That's the crayon. That's the colored pencil. And this is the oil pastel. I know it's the oil pastel because of that black streak, and I can cut lines into it. So crayon it works really, really well with, but colored pencil, it's really luck of the draw with colored pencil. It's not as repellent. Oil pastel can be very repellent as well, but crayon is mainly the ones people use whenever they use the technique of wax resist. Oh, I did that again. Need to get more water. Okay, toothbrush splatters. This is where kids start to get a little bit more excited. You can take a toothbrush. Don't use the one that you use for your teeth. Just use a spare one. They're $1. Don't brush your teeth afterwards with it. No, don't do that. Please don't do that. But toothbrush splatters are pretty interesting because people really like the effect that you get. Wet the tip, like the very tip of the brush right in here. Stick the little tip of it in the paint. And all you gotta do, you have to start right here. You can just scrape it. I'm gonna use my brush. But you start from front to back, and what happens is you get a splatter effect. And people use this technique mainly for making stars and things like that. It's a really interesting technique. I know it will splatter into the other boxes. That is fine. That's not going to hurt your grade any. I know what this thing's about. I know it would do that. So, all right, scrape into dry from wet. So what you do here is you take some of the make a small little puddle. Not too big. Flip your paintbrush over and take the wet and you scrape out. The more pressure you apply, the more that you drag out, and the more you leave more like scratch marks. Clean on my brush. Okay, clean this. Okay. What I'm going to do next is called lift out, and it's pretty self-explanatory. You just kind of add in a color. And then you'll take a paper towel or a rag, and then you just press and dab it out. Sometimes it'll leave patterns if you crunch it up really good. Sometimes it'll just make it a little bit lighter. It's really good if you make a mistake and you need to soak something up. You can just take this and just press it to it and then just lift it straight up, trying not to move in a wayward motion. So it's a really interesting way of going about it that way. And I just did that again. I don't know what's wrong with me. Okay, here comes everybody's favorites. Salt technique. For salt technique, you can use just about any kind of salt. In the classroom, we use rock salt. You can use table salt. You can use kosher salt. You can use ground salt. Any kind of salt will do this, but understand that you don't need a lot of salt. You don't need a massive amount of salt in order to do this technique. What you will need a puddle. You will need to make sure your watercolor is full of color, has a lot of color to it, and it's wet. It's got a small puddle going on. So much so that you can practically push it around. Then you'll take the salt. You can either sprinkle it on or just kind of place it like how I'm doing. So basically, once you put the salt on there, it sucks up all the color around it and it will draw it into it, making kind of like a small starburst effect. Sometimes it does not like to work, especially if you don't have enough water. I've had different degrees of success with this method, but some students just think it's really cool that it will suck all the color up into it and absorb it that way. I'm gonna add a few more little kernels. Just so it'll, because there's a lot. Your salt should also start turning practically the same color as the, see, just right over to it. But it should start turning the same color as the color that you picked. The next technique I'm going to use is plastic wrap. Just going to get a little bit of it out. Plastic wrap is a really interesting technique because it can make things look like ice, basically. What you do, this is another one that you have to leave to dry, but you kind of take a little puddle and while it's still wet, you take the plastic wrap and you stick it over top and you crunch it. And you just leave it. Once it's dry, you'll peel it up and it will leave kind of an interesting pattern. Lastly, another favorite of my students, rubbing alcohol. A little too much rubbing alcohol there. So, how we do rubbing alcohol, basically the rubbing alcohol will propel color away. You do need a bit of a puddle. Now, it doesn't take much. Some kids just tend to put way too much on here. I'm just going to do a droplet. If it comes off of my finger. There we go, there's one. Come. And just dab it in with the brush. So basically it just repels the color and makes like this little textural area. Let me see if I can do it better. I'm just not getting enough drops. But yeah, rubbing alcohol just propels the area, and it can make a really cool looking texture as long as you don't quite overdo it. So those are your basic watercolor techniques. There are others. There's just not limited to just this. There are many different other water-soluble things. If you aren't comfortable using like a palette of watercolors, you can always use watercolor pencils. If you would like a tutorial on that, just let me know if you would, or if you're interested in seeing how watercolor pencils actually work. It's like coloring with color pencils and then painting over it, and just painting it with water and it becomes paint. So if you're curious about that, just let me know. And just make sure you leave your stuff up to dry like this. And once it's dry, you can peel off, or salt technique. You can knock off the salt, you can peel up the wrapper, and you can peel these up and everything will be ready. Oh, I almost forgot. We didn't finish wet over dry. So let's take some wet over dry. And you can see it layer. When you do wet over dry, the under layer will may come up a little bit, but some of the under layer will actually show through because watercolors are transparent. That's just how they roll. So, there we go. There's the true ending. Kind of just forget about what I was doing, didn't I? Alright, so spilt some of the rubbing alcohol. It smells like rubbing alcohol in there now. But yeah, just leave your sketchbook open to dry. It should only take, roughly 5 to 10 minutes. So just let it dry, and then you can start peeling up things. Like my masking fluid right here. It's dry right here, so I can just start peeling that up. See, told you it can look easy. For those of you, mostly are probably going to have masking tape. So let me peel my masking tape up. Remember, if it doesn't come up, you can apply heat to it and it'll fix it that way. This is probably nowhere near ready yet. And this is definitely nowhere near ready yet. Sometimes the salt takes an hour or two, or even overnight, depending on how much you laid down, how much water you put down. But that's a thin layer of mask out, so it came underneath it a little bit. So, but yeah, those are your basic watercolor techniques that you're going to need for class, or any basic watercolor painting. You can make all kinds of textures and things out just by applying these techniques. All right, I'll see y'all in the next technique video.